thanks all of you for being here. It's so incredible and surreal, not just to see these Miyoko Ito works, but to be visiting a place I've never been before, which is very beautiful, and to encounter all of you here. So thanks for making this part of your evening. I want to thank Marius and John for setting this room up tonight, and for Maria for making my trip so smooth, and of course to Owen. And in many ways, this is a sort of full circle kind of moment for me personally, because I came to know of this amazing artist named Miyoko Ito 10 years ago, about exactly 10 years ago, when I worked at a place called the Renaissance Society at the University of Chicago, where Solveig had hired me. And Ito died in 1983, but she had the biggest exhibition of her life in 1980 at the Renaissance Society. And Solveig hired me to come in for 1 year and make an archival exhibition. The Renaissance Society was celebrating 100 years of existence, which for us in the United States is like glacial. It's unbelievable. So I was a big admirer of the Renaissance Society. It's a really important place in the United States. So I uprooted in San Francisco, and I went to work for Solveig, and there were many wonderful artists who had their first museum shows at the Renaissance Society. And in going through the archives, as you can imagine, I spent most of my time opening up the boxes of people like Felix Gonzalez Torres and Mike Kelly and many others to find notes and sketches and all sorts of things related to their shows. But I had never heard of Miyoko Ito, so I didn't open the box until I went to visit with a painter outside of Chicago. It was a studio visit, and I went to his house, and he had an Ito on the wall, and it stopped me cold. And then I went back into this archival box and found, among many other things, great pieces of ephemera from that show in Chicago and beautiful black and white photographs of the show that was a survey of her work. I think it had about 50 paintings in the show. And this was her last public exhibition until 2017, which is sort of astonishing to think about because she was so massively talented. And it even includes the painting on the right that's on these great posters that this institution has made and that I've seen on buses and trams all over town, which is incredible. And if you look on the far left, there's a work called Island in the Sun, and that's the painting that came into full living color reality for me when I went to visit with this artist, John Pittman, who's been living with this painting since 1980 when he acquired it. And it's hard really to know how art moves you. Like I said, I didn't know this artist. I was just so electrified by encountering the work. And I had a feeling that perhaps this artist and I would forge a long relationship. I didn't know if she was living. I didn't know if she was dead. I didn't know that she was born and raised in Berkeley, which is just across the water from where I lived in San Francisco. And so I made an archive show. It's a little memory lane for Solveig. We made an exhibition, I'll just talk real quickly, called Let Us Celebrate While Youth Lingers and Ideas Flow. The name came from a great Ree Morton sculpture that was on the back of this little catalog we made. And in addition to lots and lots of really wonderful archival material from those boxes I mentioned, we showed a handful of artworks, and I just picked this one because it's from the great William Pope L., who recently died. It's a piece called Well, and it was caused to do some experimental things, which Solveig was very game for, and Raymond Pettibone had painted a mural in the hallway outside of the gallery when he had his show, 15, 20 years before, and we excavated part of it. It was still on view. The Renaissance Society had paid private contractors to cover it up, thinking that at some point in the history it would be excavated. So it's still a bigger project waiting to be done. Anyway, we reached, I'll skip over those real quick. I'm embarrassed to show you this picture because I was so, at the last minute, excited to share Miyoko Ito's work with the public, but there was no place to hang it. So I put it in this really terrible location on the top of this landing, so people would come over and kind of reach their bodies over to see this painting, which was sort of a disaster. But compulsion is a strange thing. So this was also something that was in the archive of the Renaissance Society. It was a letter that Ito sent to the director at that museum for 40 years called Suzanne Guez. And it was so absolutely perfectly folded, I was too afraid to unfold it. And I didn't, and it had this little piece of dried grass in it, and it sort of sticks with me as a metaphor, or as a talisman to her practice and my interest in her practice, and kind of secrets that constantly unfold within the work. So I'm going to tell you about her work and her life and the process of making a couple exhibitions, and then and tell you about this book too. It was hard to find these paintings initially, not because they were hidden in an attic or a basement somewhere in Chicago, but because, in fact, they sold during her lifetime, but the records were not exactly kept well, and they sold not to, for example, the biggest, most prominent patrons of the Art Institute of Chicago, but to artists and to people who liked the work, and to people who lived just north of the city and had the painting on their wall for 40 years. So there's no database that tells you where that sort of stuff is. So it's been a real kind of detective story to try to find this stuff. And some of the more interesting things that I've found, and where the story really begins, is in Berkeley, California, where she's born in 1918. Her parents emigrated from Japan. She spent a few years in Japan as a child, maybe 5 years, and started to experiment with calligraphy. She talks about how she wasn't much of an athlete in school, and her curiosity for art was awakened. She came back to Berkeley. She went to big Berkeley High School, and then she went to the University of California at Berkeley. It had a pretty dynamic art department. What they were teaching at the time was something they described as synthetic cubism, which is a term that's gone so far out of favor. I have to look it up every time I'm about to give a talk because I can't remember what it is, but it's sort of late stage cubism. So it's not quite as bracketed and complex of a picture plane as what Picasso and George Braque were doing at the early stages of Cubism. There's a little more breathing room. And she made these 3 watercolors when she was a student, an undergraduate at Berkeley. And apparently, to be an art major at that time was to watercolor, hard stop. There was no painting going on. She was pulled out of school her senior year when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, and the President of the United States imprisoned Japanese Americans from coast to coast in the United States. Just south of San Francisco, there was a horse track called Tanforan, and it was transformed. The horse stalls were transformed into dormitories for Japanese Americans and their families. Strangely, it was well documented by a famous American photographer called Dorothea Lange, who was paid by the government to take the pictures but not to release them. So they didn't actually come to light until many, many years later through the Library of Congress. This is one of her images. It's a very tragic story. It's a really tragic American story. Tanforan was an assembly center, so they gathered people there for 3, 4, 5 months and then split people off. Tanforan, parenthetically, is now a mall, which is also a tragic American story. And reportedly, it's about to be demolished and transformed into a big biotech campus. Anyway, before she left Berkeley, she hastily married her boyfriend, a guy called Harry Ichiyasu, and they were at Tanforan together. They were married so they would be sent to the same camp. Through the help of something called the Quaker Society of America, she was allowed to leave. She was allowed to get a graduate degree, and she went to a school called Smith in Massachusetts, an all-women's college. When she got there, she discovered there was, in fact, no art department. So she left, and that's how she ended up in Chicago at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Harry, her husband, was not so lucky, and he was transferred to a place called Tanforan, which is in Utah, in the desert. And in the summer, it's blisteringly hot, and it's a miserable winter. And amazingly, she was allowed to visit him there, and they could take day trips. And this is a watercolor that only recently came to light that she made on one of her visits to Harry in Utah. And I happened to drive through Utah a couple years ago, and I was able to stop at a museum there that honors this miserable history. And you can see these giant original logbooks of everybody who was interred there. And you can see the visitor logs too. So in addition to Harry, who I could see did serious time there, I could see that Ito came for the whole summer. It's amazing. Anyway, so then she moves to Chicago, and she's still working in a watercolor mode, and it's 1947. She matriculates there, but she actually never got a degree, which is curious. And you could tell that she's really informed by whatever comes after synthetic, Cubism, Matisse and Raoul Dufy, and everyone, of course, looking to Europe, and everybody seems to be looking out a window all the time. And so a couple more examples of this on the left, and then she becomes really interested in lithography, and she connects with a teacher from the School of the Art Institute and takes evening classes in carving in stone. So this is 1950, and she's already had her first child, and you can see obviously that her world, at least as depicted in two-dimensional artwork, is becoming a little more abstracted. You can see in the work on the top, this lithograph, Objects in the Nursery, but in the bottom, she's still grounded in a sort of consensual reality, I guess you might call it. But it doesn't take long for the picture plane to begin breaking apart, and her story in abstraction, while in a language that's completely hers, of course, follows the story of many post-war American artists, when first you dry out the window and then the window seems to completely explode. And all that's left are the shapes and colors of the window and the things on the table and the vase and everything else. So this was one of the early works that I came across, but it was at the time, there was really no scholarship on her since the time of her death. So when I would encounter works like this, I would really have not much to compare it to. And so I would find this, and then maybe the next week someone would tip me off to this. So I just wanted to try to share a little bit about what that process was like for me. And it's an odd thing. And I'm not, professionally an art historian. I work as a curator and a writer. So I felt, what did I feel? Like it was normal or something. Like there was no right way to do it. And so it felt exciting and strange. Kalamazoo from 1959, part of a body of works that are much larger and horizontal and map-like. And then I'd come across this astonishing thing from 1971, Interior Presence. And the title of this piece is very indicative of the work she's making for a couple decades. She's making things that materialize in the world, and in a sense they're landscapes, but it's always a reflection of something that's going on inside her mind. And I see the practice overall as a kind of negotiation that we all participate in, which is there's a big, big world out there, and there's an equally large world in our heads, and how do you negotiate that? And it's called human consciousness, and artists do it in all different ways. But she was consistent, and I mean that as not only are all the works good, which is really rare, but also the earliest works that she made have a lot in common with the very last works that she made. And in that way, she's in line with certain long game practitioners over time. Helen Frankenthaler, Saul LeWitt, Agnes Martin, people like this. So her changes are subtle. Although if you jump to the end of her life, obviously it looks pretty different. This is First Veranda. Again, she died in 1980. 3, this is what the work looks like, sort of just before her death. So I needed to make comparisons, connections between the work, and I started to think, well, this is sort of curious. Look at this really early watercolor, and look at this piece from 1971. You can see a relationship. And then if you, wow, seems noteworthy. It's unlike a lot of other artists that I know. What if you take something from 1959? I mean, it's sort of amazing. And again, her changes are nuanced. And then I came across this painting as untitled work. Many of the works are untitled. From 1970, and again, I live in San Francisco, and she spent many years in Berkeley. And this, to me, looked a lot like standing on a hill in the East Bay in Berkeley and looking out over the bay to a place called Angel Island, which is there. So I was leaving Chicago, and I reached out to some colleagues at the Berkeley Art Museum and explained that I had come across this amazing artist, and that the work had never been seen in Berkeley. And so perhaps it would be a nice thing to show the work there. And so this was the show that we did from 2017 into 2018 with just a dozen paintings. I learned a lot about her from older folks that I connected with in Chicago, but again, they were still difficult to find at that time. So this was a very fractured and limited picture of the practice, but because the work rhymes with the work, it made for a really coherent exhibition. And it was part of a series called Matrix that the museum has been doing a long time, that is for sort of emerging artists or overlooked artists primarily. So it fit in. And it was a really special show, and it was really well received. And one thing that captured my attention early on was, I'll just kind of move through these. There's a form that repeats in a lot of the work. It almost looks like a kind of gravestone. There. And the gentleman who does live with, and sort of communes with this painting, Island in the Sun, this red painting I showed earlier, shared with me that he felt as if all her works were, in a sense, self-portraits, and maybe all artworks are in some way, but he really saw that form as a mirror or a shadow of herself, of her head, of her shoulders, of her consciousness, of her position in space and also in time, of course. So that became the major through line of that show of just, a dozen paintings or so. And then was invited to bring a version of that show to New York to a great nonprofit called Artist Space. And it was a happy occasion for a few reasons. One, because we were able to locate a few works that I had never seen before that lived on the East Coast in New York, Connecticut, and a couple other places. And just because Berkeley's a wonderful place, but a lot of people saw it in New York. It's a different thing. So artists saw it, critics saw it, dealers saw it, and it was really exciting. It was really exciting to do. And it was right before Artist Space moved into this really beautiful place that they're in now, and the feeling of the place was much more like an artist loft or something. So it was sort of like the show that she should have had, in New York in her lifetime, but she didn't. And initially, I was a little skeptical of all the character of the space, but it really worked in her favor and accentuated the sort of architectural, physical elements in the work. And then, someone tipped me off. They said, well, Peter Doig has a couple. And I thought, wow, maybe she's not quite as unknown as I had thought. And it turned out there were a number of painters who had known of her work for some time, some of whom were in a position to collect. So that's when I thought the story could be, even bigger. And we showed a video in the front of the space It's an interview with her, and I'll play just a short clip at the end of my talk, but there are only 2 surviving interviews with her in her lifetime. They're really revealing and intense, and the sound of her voice is really idiosyncratic, so I'll play it for you. And then during the pandemic, I got a call from a painter called Matt Connors, who's a really great abstractionist who lives in New York, and he had seen the show in Artist Space a few years before, and he runs Pre-Echo Press, really in his spare time. And he reached out. I had just written this book about Bay Area artist named Jay DeFeo, and he said really nice things about it. And then he said, who's doing the Ito book? And I thought, I don't know, like, wouldn't it be crazy if we did it? We were kind of waiting for a museum to do it. Most museums are slow, and they do things in museum ways, which is a wonderful way. But no museum had sort of come forward to do this or to put on a bigger show of her work, which kind of surprised us. And so we got really excited, and we decided at the end of this phone call that we would do this thing together. And we knew that it was a quixotic project because we had to find the work. I mean, I didn't, we had to find the work, and we had to document the work. And then I would have to write, a long biographical essay about her, which really hadn't been written. So anyway, I'm really happy to be here and to be sharing this information with you for one reason, because the last sort of round of public talks that I did about Ito were really around the release of the book, and they were largely around the process of making the book and how we did the book and how we found the stuff. But I really used this as an occasion to attempt to synthesize what we'd learned from the book, because we developed the broadest picture, ever of what the practice looked like, which was kind of scary, to be honest. So anyway, here's a work from 1950, and it's an oil, and you can see it resembles her experiments in lithography. It's pretty coherent picture plane, despite the fact that it's fits in with the abstraction of the time, broadly speaking. And then just a work from 2 years later, you can see that the specifics have been erased. And then just 3 years later, now the whole thing is water. It's starting to break apart like a glacier or something. And then it doesn't take her long to form these long kind of tubular-like forms, and the paintings begin to resemble intestines, the workings of the inside of a body. I think before she became such a painter of human consciousness, there was an interior view, but I feel like it was around here. And they also start to look a little bit like rivers. These are 2 paintings that are named after rivers, and it's unclear whether the perspective is really looking out. I see them more as looking down at riverways and tributaries and the movement of liquid and time and space. And these works are bigger comparatively. And the process of the book, one of the things that was really neat about it is that we had anticipated that we would only focus on the mature works, but then we began to locate these earlier pieces, and our initial, it wasn't quite skepticism, but we thought maybe we wouldn't be quite as in love with them as we would be the things from 1974. That sense was just obliterated in seeing these things in person. So I'm really glad that we can do this talk here in the galleries, and I would encourage you all to get your face right up in these paintings, because it's an embodied experience, and they're very, very textural works. So this is good, but that's the real thing. So then the emergence of this bust-like form takes hold in about the middle 1960s. She keeps the circles, she develops the tubes, and most importantly, I think, maybe for the context of space making, is that she begins this ombre effect, the change of color and light and dark in the backgrounds of her paintings, which is really hard to do as a painter technically. And she's able to achieve it through a process of underpainting. So everything's red and green and just pencil to start out with. She says that drawing is really the root of the practice. She finds the form, she finds the painting through the act of drawing, and then she lays down these sort of backdrop colors that make everything really pop. And in some of these paintings, you can see a lot of the background. It's quite unique, actually, for her practice. And Pyramid of Silence, Mirror, Mirror, they begin to adopt these acutely psychological titles. And she has 2 kids. Her husband is a successful toy importer in Chicago. She doesn't need to work. She's selling the paintings, but I don't imagine she's making quite enough to sort of make a living. She was really free as an artist. She worked at home. She made maybe 10, 12 paintings a year. She was entirely dedicated. She's on record in an interview talking about how she had nowhere to take herself except painting. Parenthetically, I don't think it was easy to be Miyoko Ito. She seems like a really intense character. She also wasn't part of a particular clique in Chicago. Perhaps some of you have heard of, the Chicago Imagists or the Harry Who, or things that were going on around this time or were just about to start. She was a generation older than them, and she had friends who were painters, but she was largely in her own lane as an artist and as an individual. So, Sea Window, Layered Presence, these are just astonishing paintings in person, and they also begin to establish, sometimes quite more explicitly than others, a real erotics in this painterly language. And into the early 1970s, we get amazing things like E for Elisa that are on view in the gallery right now. And it's a glowing kind of a painting. It's a really, really beautiful one. And a network of squiggles. I mean, it sounds funny to say, but it's this idiosyncratic visual language that begins to emerge. I only learned much later that Ito means thread in Japanese. And there are these lone, I don't know if you can see it, you can see these threads in a lot of the work. Sea Chest and Chiffonnier, she does a number of artist residencies at a place called McDowell. And while she's there, she's struck by the fact that there's a lot of junky furniture hanging around. And she begins to arrange a lot of it as a starting point for these paintings. So in this era, you can see mirrors, sea chest, so it's a sea, but it's also a chest of drawers, and then a chiffonnier, that mirror there on top. So I was really struck by the fact that they are doors and windows, and that a chiffonnier, or a chest of drawers, are plainly visible, but they're often closed. So they can sort of reveal and conceal at the same time, which seems to be a really common thread in the practice and overall the process of confinement and expanse is one that's maybe most salient across the entire body of work. And then, I knew this painting, Todoroki, here on the left in 1974, but there was a whole body of work from the middle 70s that emerged in doing this book research. So I really had no idea that there were a couple of years when the picture plane gets remarkably shaken up. And that form that I had really come to see as her mind or her feelings or her experience is totally gone. And I don't begin to speculate what that reveals or doesn't reveal about who she was as a person, but I can say that there are not too many picture planes, in the middle of the 1970s, artists in the United States making work that looks like this. And they're really dizzying in person. And she also incorporates a color palette that's pretty unique for the time, especially in Garden. There on the right, that green just doesn't seem to appear in any of the rest of her work. And then there are, as a curator or lay art historian, there are temptations to over connect, I think, and I've tried to make space for the outlying paintings because every artist has outlying work. And thankfully with the book, we didn't have to consider that very much because the book is a very simple chronological layout of all the paintings we had found until that point. But in terms of thinking about future exhibitions, maybe a retrospective, things like this, you obviously need to make room for the largest painting she ever made that appears to be completely anomalous in the practice, Orange Cloud from 1977, which I still haven't seen in person. You may also notice, especially in an image that's this big, these nails that seem to be sticking out of the frame. They're very strange. And she's not on the record saying anything about them. So in a sense, that's where that story ends. But there are people who knew her who have things to say about the nails. And I'll tell you a little bit about it. Her dealer was a woman called Phyllis Kind in Chicago, who eventually opened a branch in New York and brought Ito's work to New York on several occasions, not that it made that much of an impact. And apparently, at some point, Phyllis had renovated her storage area for artworks, and she had carpeted these racks, which was a nightmare for these paintings because the nails would get stuck on the carpet. So somebody from the gallery reportedly contacted the artist and said, "We're having big problems with this. You might need to come over. And, what do we do about these nails?" And reportedly, Ito said, "Just hammer them in." So that's kind of another place where the story ends. But she did not hammer them in. And she could have very easily hammered them in because every other painter hammers them in. So what do we do with these things? I don't know. There's a great poet and writer named John Yao who lives in New York. And he's one of the few people who's been a champion of this work for a long time. And he has written that maybe if you are thrust into a concentration camp with the things you can sort of keep on your back, and you become a painter who makes these big things, maybe psychologically there is a temptation to keep the nails half in so that in an emergency you could pull them out and roll the paintings up and take them with you. It's a beautiful idea. It may also be that they helped her eye forge a geometry on the canvas. You could sort of squint and see a grid. Maybe that was really advantageous to her. I don't know. The late 70s are a really exciting time for Miyoko Ito. You guys are really lucky to have this Act 1 in the Desert painting here from 1977. It's a beautiful, beautiful one. And the tubes are sort of replaced by these stacks. It becomes much more, the organic quality begins to merge with this architectural building block kind of aspect, but you can still see the squares and the circles and this sort of tuft. It's hard to see. You'll see it better in person. But there are these really curious little tufts, almost like tufts of hair. So perhaps the self-portrait is never far from the practice. Sea Changes, 77. There's a rich sort of red period. Plenty of untitled pieces. And then Egyptian Night. Apparently she was an inveterate traveler. Brought home postcards. This is a close-up I wanted to show you of the painting. One of the paintings. She leaves these gaps in between the painted forms so you can see the charcoal You can see how she's drawing and finding the work. And instead of filling them in, she leaves them there. So there are these really interesting moments of tension between colors. Toward the end of her life, the paintings grow smaller. They turn horizontal. August 1979. It's a really subtle painting. Even the few vertical ones that from this era are more sort of more difficult, walls of no escape. There's often an almost game-like layout of these things, some unknowable kind of play. And then Center Stage, 1980. There's also a recurring theme of a proscenium stage and of curtains opening or closing. But she was very reticent about defining what it is that she did. She talked about how every painting is the beginning of painting all over again for her. It's a very beginner's mind kind of philosophy. So, and because she wasn't really in the spotlight, she could be whatever kind of artist she wanted to be. And I don't get the impression that there were too many of her peers asking her what these things meant. Well, how could she possibly explain what they meant? This is a work called Second Veranda from the year she died. The collectors who have this in Chicago explained to me that she had just finished it at the time of her death. When she was 65, heart condition, she'd suffered cancer twice. And again, just sort of making comparisons of work from 1957. So each painting is a beginning again, But there's a rhythm, there's a language, there's a consistency. I think about Giorgio Morandi, people like this. It's like a monastic kind of a practice, commitment. Anyway, so we set out to make the book. It was a total thrill to be in the company of these paintings, even if we did find some in the bathroom. And then we were able to date a number of works, which, talk about feeling like we were a little bit in over our heads. It took us a minute to realize that we were the most qualified people to do this. So this is a painting called Sun Afire that had no date, and by assembling all this work, we were able to make a conclusion that was probably around 1976. And this is what it looked like when we had everything photographed. I run this project space called Cushion Works in San Francisco, and they really do make cushions there. And on the third floor, they have this incredibly long work table. And so it was like one of the great days. We laid everything out and we sequenced the book. And then we went to print the thing in Italy, and I'd never been on press, for a book, and it was such a thrill to be there. And this is Massimo. I handled all the publications, and it was amazing. So we produced the book, and then we also came across a few people had reached out and given us original slides, because whereas Phyllis Kind Gallery seems to have kept no photographs of exhibitions of her work, they did take slides of individual paintings, and through different people we were able to get our hands on slides. And there's a section in the back of the book that are they're not color corrected because we don't know what the correct colors are, but it's sort of an index for paintings that we hope to find. So it's like a have you seen this painting kind of thing. And if we have found several of them since publishing the book. After I did a talk at the Renaissance Society, a guy came up to me and said, "My paintings are not in your book." And I said, "I don't know who you are." And he said, "I have 3. Amazing, amazing." So these are all Ito paintings that we hope to discover one day. And then that video that I mentioned that was produced, this great video was made by something called the Video Data Bank, which is now a part of the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. And it was started by 2 incredible women who is sort of a two-part operation. One is they produced videos with all kinds of amazing artists, black and white early video interviews that you can still sort of rent and watch and screen. And they were also a cooperatively sort of organized video lending library. So if an institution wanted to screen a video, it's still running like this today. You pay them a fee and they send you a file and you screen the video. And it's an economy of video art that's outside of major galleries and things. That was transcribed actually after her death into this really great little kind of zine thing that they made called Profiles, like a little magazine. And so we sort of cleaned it up a little bit and reproduced that in the book. And it had these great photographs. And then really strange exhibition photographs we found. This is from a place called the Hyde Park Art Center, which is just down the street from the Renaissance Society in the south side of Chicago, a show of hers in 1971. I don't know who hung it like this. It could have been her. It could have been their eccentric leader, a guy called Don Baum. Also, all the works seem to be framed in the same way, whereas most of the work is unframed. We don't know if that's her decision. It's a very, very simple wooden frame. And since finding a number of these works there, it's just really neat to see them in that same original sort of dead simple frame. And then big spreads for the Renaissance Society. A banner on the quad. Postcards, posters. And miraculously, she was included in the 1975 Whitney Biennial, but it was much less of like a spectacle then. So people may have seen the painting and loved the painting for all I know, but it didn't necessarily lead to more opportunities for her. This on the right is a Christmas card that Phyllis Kind produced with all of her artists, which is like unthinkable now. Postcards from Egypt, Egyptian Night, this letter to Suzanne Guez, and then we found a few great pictures of her in the studio. It's just wild that she's, you can see the bottom is all green. She hasn't painted it in yet. This was probably just a few years before her death. And then we put together a CV, which was a lot of work. And then I wrote an essay, which I largely just synthesized for you. And this is an unfinished painting that curiously is in the collection of a place called the Smart Museum, also at the University of Chicago. Some things that were in her studio were donated by her family after her death. So it's the only example I know of an unfinished painting by her. And then I'll play this little clip. I think it's maybe 3 or 4 minutes. And then I'm happy to answer any questions. And thanks again for being here. It's really exciting to me to be able to share this with you.